Good evening and welcome everyone to a very exciting evening here at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture as we open Over There, Montanans in the Great War. World War I was a defining moment for modern civilization, and Montana contributed to the effort like no other state in the Union. Over There features more than 200 artifacts and works of art focused on the lives of 4 individuals from Montana or closely tied to our state. It has been outright phenomenal for us to work with guest curator and catalog author Dr. H. Raphael Chacon, who spent 6 years planning this exhibition. Raphael has a heart of gold and a steel trap mind, and we are privileged to work with him. He is truly one of UM's highly esteemed professors. Go ahead. Over There shines a light on a doughboy, an aviator, a Red Cross nurse, and the U.S. ambassador to Berlin, all of whom experienced World War I victories and degradations firsthand. In addition to these Montanans, the exhibition features the enemy as another character telling the World War I story. This exhibition, a commemoration of the centennial of the U.S. entry into the Great War, explores our nation's sacrifice here on the home front and also over there. Our wonderful sponsors who made this exhibition possible include Destination Missoula and the Tourism Business Improvement District, retired Colonel Tom Ross, who was here earlier this evening, Washington Corporations, the Bill and Rosemary Gallagher Foundation, Western Montana Military Officers Association, Lowe's Home Improvement, Montana Public Radio, including Ray Eknes, who kindly compiled the World War I tunes that we heard in the lobby, Bitterroot Flower Shop, and our wonderful MMAC champion members. Programming partners include the Montana Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, the President's Lecture Series, Joining Community Forces, the Roxy Theater, the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Library's Archives and Special Collections, the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History, the School of Art, the Department of History, UM's ROTC program, and important collectors, including Hayes and Amalia Otopolik. Will you forgive me, Hayes? An amazing collector, Hayes received his BA in history and graduated from UM and the ROTC program in 1971. He's currently the Special Military History Advisor to the United States National World War I Centennial Commission. Thank you, Hayes, for your more than significant contributions to this exhibition. And other important lenders also contributed, including Paul Thomas, Keith Harden, who's here with us tonight, Tom Ross again, the Gilbert Milliken Art Resource Center, and Betsy Bach. Sincere thanks to all of you. Now, 7 more programs associated with this exhibition are coming, including this coming Monday, that's September 25th, when we present in partnership with the President's Lecture Series, America's Deadliest Battle, an experiential film of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. That's presented by Joe Throckmorton, filmmaker and owner of Joe Throckmorton Filmworks. So then that's at 8 o'clock Monday night, right here in the Montana Theater. Dr. Chacon will give another talk about the art of the World War I era on November 16th. Dr. Harry Fritz will present for us on November 30th. Dr. Lisa Simon will present on December 7th. And don't miss the 3-night Monday World War I movie series at the Roxy. That starts October 9th. Times and places, go to our website. I want to acknowledge now the fine and hard work of MMAC Curator of Art, Jeremy Canwell, for working so hard with Raphael to pull off this wonderful exhibition together, and also thank graduate student Nicholyn Garner, who assisted as well. And last mention before I introduce Dr. Chacon is that we have a wonderful catalog accompanying this exhibition. In case you didn't note it in the lobby, He's the author, of course, and at the end of tonight's talk, he's happy to sign your copy. It's $17 general public, $15 for students and seniors. Dr. Chacon is professor and division coordinator of art history and criticism in the School of Art. He holds an A.B. in art from Wabash College and received his M.A. and Ph.D. degrees in art history with honors, University of Chicago. A specialist on Renaissance and Baroque art, Dr. Chacon teaches a broad range of courses on the history of art and criticism, both within and beyond the European tradition. His research interests are predominantly in architectural history, historic preservation, and the development of art in the inland Northwest. He was the 2007 recipient of the Dorothy Ogg Award for individual contributions to historic preservation, and in 2008 he published The Original Man, The Life and Work of Montana Architect A.J. Gibson in partnership with MMAC. He's published seminal articles on the art of Glacier National Park and groundbreaking research on the development of modernist architecture in Montana. He keeps his eyes on global aesthetics, ancient and contemporary, and he's studied the art associated with medieval and Renaissance pilgrimage routes in Europe and has walked the Camino de Santiago in Spain and France twice. That's a long walk. He's lectured abroad on topics as wide-ranging as contemporary public arts projects to the history of flags. And in 2014, the Cuban-born scholar that he is delivered a TEDx talk on genetic testing and family history. Most recently, he was named among the top 10 lecturers of the Smithsonian Institution's prestigious Journeys program. How about a warm welcome for Raphael?
Thank you so much for being here. It is indeed an honor. And I want to express my gratitude to Barbara and also to Jeremy Canwell and Nicholin Garner. Let's have another round of applause. These people have done a remarkable job putting together what I think is not just a powerful, but also a beautiful exhibition. And so I'm very, very grateful. And it's also been, for me, a privilege to work with MMAC and its staff over a couple of years, close to 6 years now. Guest curating an exhibition has been a rare opportunity for me to stretch beyond what sometimes feel like the narrow confines of my own discipline of art history. And so curating has allowed me to indulge some of my passions, including the museum, which is a marvelous laboratory, in my opinion, where the artifact and the work of art reach beyond their narrow confines into all spheres of human endeavor and creativity. So more importantly, this exhibition has afforded me a chance to indulge my passion for military history and specifically the Great War. I've learned a great deal, and I've paused a number of times in these last few years with gratitude and admiration for the sacrifice of so many men and so many women who took part in this awful, terrible event, this defining event in our history. Soldiers, men and women who went before us. So we're all here tonight in some ways to commemorate the centennial of the U.S. entry into the Great War and to pay homage to these men and women. But I also believe that we wish to understand our nation better and perhaps gain perspective on the problems that it faces today. And so in some ways, these images, these photographs, these posters, these works of art that we have the opportunity to see, in no small part to the fact that they have been preserved by amazing collectors like Hayes Otopolik and Tate Jones at the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History at the Fort. Individuals have preserved these materials very much as relics, but also as testaments to a very, very important moment in our history, a defining moment in our history. So we're here to pay homage to these men and women, but also to gain perspective on what it means to be Americans today. I have learned much about the Great War, spending countless hours reading, watching a lot of films and documentaries, traveling to conferences and overseas as well, collecting artifacts, speaking with specialists, in essence, curating an exhibition. But more important than any knowledge that I've gained in this process, I've had the opportunity to reflect on who we are today as Americans and where and how we got here as Americans. And understanding the Great War is really crucial for us to consider ourselves modern citizens. So understanding this war through the experience of a Montana doughboy, such as Sidney W. Smith, whom you see here on the right, an aviator like William Belzer, Bill Belzer, a nurse like Josephine Hale, and a diplomat, our U.S. Ambassador to Berlin, James Gerard Watson, a diplomat who, understanding the story through their lives and their participation in this war has helped me clarify some fundamental questions about our national identity. I don't have many answers, to be honest with you, but at least the questions were raised, and at least through these folks, there was a conduit, a way of understanding how we have become the nation that we have become. For me, the questions have included questions like, what is America's proper role of leadership in the world? How do we identify and characterize our enemies? How do we treat the stranger and the immigrant in our midst, within our borders? What role should women and minorities play in the traditionally majority male arena or sphere of war? What does it mean to be a true patriot and a hero? And how does a soldier live with continuing trauma, the trauma of war having left the battlefield? These are the questions I've sought from my engagement with this great war. And these are not just questions that were asked 100 years ago. They're questions that are quite relevant to us today. So the stories of these lives, these four individuals, has really helped me in some ways to understand the bigger picture and to understand how the individual, and we in America pride ourselves in having a heightened sense of what it means to be an individual, but how the individual intersects with the global scene. We tend to think of Montana as isolated. We tend to think of Montana as far removed from world events because of where we are and because of the fact that our population is generally low. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been impacted by the world and that we haven't shaped the world by our presence and our participation in events like the Great War. The Great War was indeed great. A century later, its dimensions are still either immeasurable, if not incomprehensible to us. Its greatness is measured in, if greatness itself is measured in firsts, then the so-called war to end all wars was indeed a great war. It was the world's first truly modern war. Now imagine a war without tanks in the field, airplanes in the sky, submarines at sea. Imagine a war without high-fire, precise artillery, machine guns, chemical weapons, radios, and vehicles with combustion engines transporting troops and equipment across vast territories. Imagine a war fought without the use of radio broadcasts, propaganda posters, photographs, and other print media. All of these were novelties in the Great War, and they were used on a grand scale. They set a precedent, a paradigm for the way we would fight wars for the next 100 years. The Great War created the world as we know it. 5 venerable empires collapsed, and out of their ashes rose the scores of nation-states that make up the modern world. The defeat of Germany brought down the Hohenzollern monarchy and replaced it with a modern republic, a new nation so burdened by the conditions of defeat that it dissolved into the extremism and depravity of the Third Reich, and yet another devastating world war. The defeat of Germany's ally, Austro-Hungary, led to the crumbling of the Habsburg Empire, the collapse of the oldest ruling house in Europe, and the birth of the many nations of Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The dissolution of the Romanov dynasty in Russia gave rise to that great experiment in communism known as the Soviet Union, our erstwhile ally and later Cold War foe. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire led to the creation of modern Turkey and the many nations of Central Asia, the Near East, and the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. World War I seemed to open a Pandora's box of tribal, ethnic, nationalist, and religious tensions, bigotry, and hatred, formerly kept in check by these same empires. Sometimes festering for centuries, these demons were free to manifest themselves in the later industrialized wars and brutal conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. Today, 100 years later, we're not only trying to pick up the pieces from that war and that dissolution of those empires, we're arguably still trapped in many of those same struggles. So great was this war that we still cannot comprehend its magnitude. How many millions of actual soldiers and civilians died? We don't know. How many millions of refugees were displaced? We still do not have answers to these fundamental questions about the Great War. With no living veterans now to interview, historians must now resort to what are incomplete and often contradictory and sometimes propagandistic and ideologically biased records. What we do know is that we would not be here in our present circumstances without the Great War and the sacrifices of a generation of men and women across the world, both over there and on the home front. The United States would not be the global military power that it is today without demonstrating its grit on that stage 100 years ago. If the war reshaped America's status in the world, it also transformed our internal politics. The war effort was a form of equalizer that transformed waves of recent immigrants to America into Americans all. And by the way, there's a poster in the exhibition in the Malloy Gallery that you'll see an honorific female figure putting a wreath of laurels on a monument. And on that monument are names like Levi and Witkowski and Italian names, Spanish names, Eastern European names, hardly pronounceable Greek names, hardly legible Greek names. The message of that is that all of them were united as Americans in this great effort, participating in this fantastic cataclysm that the world was a part of. The war was in fact an equalizer that welcomed all these people into the fabric, into the fold of the nation. Simultaneously, however, fear of the enemy both abroad and within our borders distorted, some would say perverted, our sense of democracy, fairness, and justice. By the way, do you know who you're looking at? You good Missoulians out there? It's Jeannette Rankin, the first woman to serve in Congress and the only individual to vote against both entry into World War I and World War II. The so-called federal sedition law, modeled on our own state's version, and responding to the xenophobia, a growing paranoia, and the exigencies of the war effort, denied certain Americans their constitutional freedoms of speech, assembly, and worship. To speak against the war effort could land you in jail or worse. If you were a conscientious objector, a pacifist, a member of a labor union, a Hutterite, a Mennonite, or an Amish, or simply an American who spoke with an accent or read the Bible in German, you were suspect, subject to harassment and all forms of indignities from your own neighbors. And you might even face criminal prosecution and jail time. Voicing anything but support for the war and ardent patriotism could end in death. It was a strange time in American history. This exhibition is an opportunity for all of us to revisit the Great War through the lives of Montanans, men and women who experienced, as Barbara said, both its victories and its degradations. And they did it firsthand. They were there on the front lines. Men like a doughboy, Sidney W. Smith, who was a hero of the Lost Battalion, and I hope you take some time in the galleries to see his artifacts so beautifully collected by Hayes Oda-Pollock, to see the very textures that he handled, the materials that he handled, the uniform he wore. And you'll see that there was a man who was a hero, a farm boy from Montana who went off to battle and did his duty. In the process, he became a hero of the Lost Battalion, what is known as the Lost Battalion, the Meuse-Argonne, one of the two Meuse-Argonne campaigns, saving his fellow soldiers, risking his life, and he was one of the few survivors of that campaign, that pivotal moment in the history of the war that set America to victory, and America and its allies to victory. And you can also learn more about that campaign when you hear Joe Throckmorton speak about his documentary on Monday evening in the President's Lecture Series. Sidney W. Smith was also a PTSD victim. They called it shell shock back then, but his entire life was in fact characterized by what we would call PTSD today, by trauma. And he wrote and spoke eloquently about what it was like not to be able to sleep with his wife because of the nightmares and the shouting and the screaming that he experienced night after night after night for the entire duration of his lifetime. It's a compelling story, and it's very powerful when you hear it from the man's own mouth. You think of PTSD as a current issue. You think of it as something from Vietnam or from the more recent campaigns, but this is in fact the condition of war for all time. And his life is in fact a testimony to what he suffered as a result of the heroism. So these are some of the artifacts that are in the cabinets in the Paxson Gallery. This is William Belzer, and he was one of America's first men to take to the air. And as you can read in the exhibition, America was not ready for aviation. I mean, we had been pioneers in aviation, but we were woefully unprepared to take to the skies. So the Air Service, in fact, it's pathetic the number of planes that we started and the number of qualified pilots that we had at the beginning of the war. So our taking to the air and helping, assisting the Allies was an enormous effort. And by the end of the war, we were actually a top-notch air service in comparison to everybody else in the war. William Belzer was among the first Americans up there. He trained first with the French, or the French Escadrille, the Lafayette Escadrille, and then eventually serves his own army, his own air service. And here we see him as a young man, having been decorated for his feats of valor in the air. Flying was dangerous. Flying was risky. Flying was a novelty. Imagine flying in an open cockpit. Imagine the temperature, how cold and wet. It was France, it's always cold and wet. These men didn't know how high they could go before they started losing consciousness. They sometimes flew so low that they were really risking hitting structures, being shot down very easily. It was a risky endeavor. And so they put their lives on the line for reconnaissance missions, which is a fancy term. It's a French term for spying, basically photographing enemy positions. And William Belzer was among the heroes, our first heroes in the air. And then there's Josephine Hale, a woman who's almost all of her collection, her works of art, her paintings, and artifacts, including her nursing uniforms from the period when she served in the Red Cross. All of those things are here at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture's permanent collection. Josephine Hale lied to go into the service, to fight in the war. Actually, not to fight in the war, but to serve in the Red Cross. But she did it in not the way that you typically think of people lying to go to the war. Soldiers, we know often, male soldiers often lied about being older than they were, even though they might have been 14 or 15, they wanted to fight, so they lied about their birth dates. She actually went the other way. This 40-year-old woman claimed that she was 35 years old so that she could serve, because at that point the Red Cross actually had a cap at 35 for serviceable females. But what is interesting here, besides the very sexism of this story, is the fact that she was ardent about going over there, just as much as the aviator or the doughboy. She wanted to serve. She wanted to be on the front lines. She was also of French ancestry, French-Canadian ancestry, so she was fluent in the language. And she went there in the only capacity that women could go, and that is to serve in the Red Cross. And so the artifacts, her drawings, her photographs, the paintings, everything that you have in the cases in the exhibition are a testament to that intense desire to be there on the front lines. You'll notice that we have a couple of her uniforms, including the dress, uniform that the Red Cross nurses wore in public on the streets, the formal coat. By the way, that was tailored by Abercrombie and Fitch. I bet you didn't know that that was around back then. A very different kind of company back then. But we also have her aprons, the covers for her sleeves, the veils that the nurses wore back then, some of them still bearing the blood stains of the service on the front lines. By the way, that's Josephine in the back row on the right side, and that little photograph is in the display. And these are some of her articles. Here's Jeremy Canwell holding Josephine Hale's apron with some of those stains that are visible. Josephine Hale, incidentally, had such a powerful experience during the war that the French government recognized her service. She stayed on and became a quite well-known artist in her day in Paris, and eventually came back to her home in Great Falls. The fourth individual that you're introduced to in this show is our man in Berlin. This is Ambassador James Watson Gerard, who, and as the caption says, the man who defied the Kaiser. Because he guarded for the first years of the war as America's representative in Berlin, he guarded our neutrality, preserving primarily the opening of the maintenance of open sea lanes in the North Atlantic. And of course, you know that we were neutral, in theory we were neutral, but our trading partners were all the Western European allies. They were the French and the English. We traded actually very little with Germany. So Germany had a vested interest in disrupting that trade. And we had a vested interest in maintaining those open sea lanes so that we could continue to aid our old friends, England and France. It was Ambassador Gerard's job to do that. And it was also to hold court at the imperial court, and in fact to defend our interests there. He's not a Montanan, incidentally. He was married to a Montanan, though, a very well-known Montanan. The woman that you see there to the left is Mary Daly, the daughter of our copper king Marcus Daly. So they spent many years coming to Montana, particularly to Hamilton, or near Hamilton, to the Daly mansion, the Daly home known as Riverside. Here's some more images of the ambassador before taking his post in Berlin. We know that he was a favorite at court, one of the more popular ambassadors in the imperial court. The Kaiser and the Empress were familiar with him, and they liked him. Again, he was quite popular, but he grew increasingly restless and increasingly dissatisfied with the tack that Germany was taking, its brutality in the war, and began to publicly speak against the Germans. So Germany had no issues at all with firing him or expelling him when it was clear that the United States was going to declare war on the German Empire. And then he came back, and his career after coming back to the United States is interesting in its own right. He became the greatest publicist in America for World War I and our involvement in it, the greatest champion, if you will, of our effort overseas. He became a publicist, a public lecturer, and you'll see some of the invitation letters, and there's a huge tome that records his travels in the Western states when he toured, when he did a lecture circuit here in the West. He was an author, a quite prolific writer. He wrote 2 books. One of them, My 4 Years in Germany, became a bestseller. Again, he was an advocate the whole time for the U.S. involvement in the war and in the defeat of Germany. And he also, interestingly enough, became a filmmaker. That book was made into a film, a Hollywood movie, which is called My 4 Years in Germany. And that film is credited with being the first of the Great War epics. So if you think about all those films about World War II, well, their origin is in the ambassador's tale, as he told it, his 4 years in Germany. And that film is also credited with saving Hollywood, because apparently the industry was in a complete slump, and that film was so popular that it was revived through again, the telling of this story, his particular story. And I think I actually have this quote here, and the quote is much longer in the exhibition. You can read it on the walls for yourself. But I think this man was a prophet, and in some ways he saw what was coming with Germany. He not only understood the militarism, the rising militarism, not just its imperialism and its Kaiserism terms that he used, but I think he saw what was on the horizon for Germany if it continued on this in its militancy. So, the ambassador. And then, as Barbara also mentioned in her introduction, there is, in fact, another character in this exhibition, and that is the character of the enemy. And of course, the enemy is an abstraction. The individual soldier was, of course, our enemy. And we intentionally put images of German soldiers Some of them look an awful lot like the posters and the certificates and the badges and the things that are related to American soldiers. And the whole point of that is to remind us that they were young men too on the other side who shed blood as well for their Kaiser, their empire, their nation, their ideology. But still, the suffering, the sacrifice, in some ways, in some measure, was equal to our own. So there are indeed sympathetic images like this aviator, this wounded aviator in a poster for a war bond, a German war bond. And some of the materials of the war, like this helmet there from the German side, are in the exhibition. But we also put a lot of information about the people we identified as the enemy. And of course, it was clear to identify the German generals as responsible for this war. They're the ones who initiated the brutality. They're the ones who invaded Belgium and France and Russia, etc. So Hindenburg, Ludendorff, these individuals are highlighted among our concept of the enemy. But no one was a greater enemy to America than this man, this very petty, inefficient, thin-skinned, very unpredictable man, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Willy, as he was known. And it's this man who became very clearly for us our enemy. And so many of the posters that you see in the exhibition parody him as the little cowardly weasel that you see there in the lower right of this image, being driven away by Uncle Sam's hammer. The Kaiser was a clear image of the enemy, clearly easy to satire, easy to caricaturize. And then we came up with a new enemy. And this is the image of the Hun. This is a caricature that we invented to, in fact, paint the German people, certainly their soldiers, with a very, very broad brush. And that image, the Germans just couldn't abide with this. The Germans considered themselves the most rational, civilized nation in Europe. And to see themselves depicted as a barbarian, as an uncivilized, subhuman, ape-like monster, to see their own their heroes and their young men depicted like this as rapers and pillagers. I don't know, but this image on the right, should that not evoke the King Kong movie, which will come around very... to the Germans, this was appalling. And yet we use this image very, very effectively. In fact, next to Uncle Sam, to James Montgomery Flagg's famous image of "I want you" for the U.S. Army, next to Uncle Sam, the Hun is the most popular figure in World War I's imagery. And that image of the Hun continued, and it engendered a whole generation, in fact, of images, satirical posters that degrade the enemy and treat the enemy not as an equal, not as a noble adversary, but in fact as subhuman. And think about how often we saw that in World War II. Our enemies were treated as if they were less than human. And then in some ways it justified our taking them out. So the Hun is a powerful figure. Historically, it's a paradigm. It's a visual paradigm for something that would then become much more intense in the later 20th century. So on that cheery note, I'm going to end this discussion, and we're going to open up for some questions and answers. I hope you come back. This is an exhibition that you can't see just once. I mean, you could walk through it, be repelled, or be attracted, but you might want to come back and spend some time with it. There's a lot of different kinds of material, a variety of stuff, and I really want to invite you to spend some time with this and to ask the significant questions, not just the historical questions, but the pressing questions of our own time. So thank you very much for your attention. And by the way, I have another invitation. After tonight's event, if you still have any energy and you would like a little champagne and cake, please come and join us for an afterglow at 2825 Stockyard Road. It's over there by Johnny Carino's on the North Reserve, Unit F4. We would love to have you come out and join us for a little celebration. Are there any questions out there? Yes, Julia.
What is the term Hun? Where is that from? It's such an odd term.
It is a very strange term. It's obviously related to Hungary, right? But it's not. We actually don't know why that particular term was chosen to parody the Germans, but the Hun as a tribe, as an ancient tribe, was characterized by these marauding people on horseback who raided and pillaged as they in fact invaded parts of Europe, Western Europe. It was an Eastern tribe that migrated across from Central Asia, and in its process it brutalized Western Europe. So it became a convenient moniker for a marauding army that was, uncontrollable. And so I don't know specifically if there was a moment when, in fact, somebody decided, let's use that one, but it seemed to fit. And of course, the Germans hated it because it didn't describe their own ethnic history, their own sense of nobility as a people. So, yeah, it's a great question. Yeah?
Wasn't Attila the Hun?
Yes, of course, Attila the Hun. Yes, of course, the most famous Hun was Attila, but he was not German as far as I know.
What century was that?
That's in the Middle Ages, so it's much, much earlier than this. But we basically picked a generic term for barbaric horde, and the Hun seemed to fit. I suppose we could have called them the Mongols, but that would have been too far east to pin on the Germans. Yeah. Yes?
Very inappropriate question for an art history teacher, but maybe you'll have knowledge to do it. Probably half the posters we see are buy U.S. bonds, buy U.S. bonds. We've gone through Vietnam and all our things. We don't see things buy U.S. bonds. What was the nature of the government and the policies that made such a drive for buy U.S. bonds? Was it involve the populace, or was it necessary for financing?
That's a great question, and I can't answer it. I'm sure there are experts out there, historians, who actually do know this history quite well. But I think you in some ways, you've answered the question. It was actually both. It was through the bond effort that, in fact, people were recruited to the effort. Their loyalties, they were drawn into the war. By buying a bond, you were actually committing yourself to the effort. That meant that you were now a part of the whole movement to support the war. But it was definitely financial. They had to raise the funds to wage this war, and this was the major way of doing it. So that explains why the poster. So think of the poster as actually an appeal for funding, which it was, a recruitment tool, certainly, for support, and also an opportunity to shape the dialogue, to shape the message. So a piece of propaganda. And of course, these posters, the majority of them came from the federal government, from our state entities. So they got to shape the message. And so the poster works on all those levels. And obviously it works on a sentimental level, a personal level as well. When you see a dying mother or a mother in need, when you see a horrific figure, endangering that figure, it touches the heart. And so many of these posters were actually quite manipulative to get all three of those effects. Yes, Ruth.
On the King Kong poster,
Yes.
culture was written on the club. What's your interpretation of that?
This poster here, yeah, it's very interesting. It's the German word Kultur, which does indeed mean culture. It's interesting. It basically tells us that, and on the hat you'll see militarism. So the argument here is that the Hun, or the Germans, were in fact using both culture and militarism to in fact wage this war. It's an acknowledgement that they were in fact imposing their culture, at least wanted to ultimately impose their culture on the rest of the world. So it was in fact seen as if we in a democracy were threatened both by German culture and that kind of Prussian militarism that they had, that the German Empire had inherited. Yes, Jerry.
You mentioned in your preliminary remarks something about not only the enemy abroad, but also the enemy within. And you have some very nice pieces in the collection. Could you comment a little bit about that? Because Montana was really in the center of the way we treated the enemy within.
Yeah. Yes, I'll repeat the question. The question is about the topic of the enemy within and the choice to put that in the exhibition. It is, in some ways, it's a sub-theme for this exhibition. Again, the exhibition is really about the lives of 4 individuals. and then this concept of the enemy. But we have to recognize that Americans did not see the enemy simply over there. We saw the enemy also within our own ranks, within our own population, within our own borders. And of course, that's true in any war, and there were reasons for that. I mean, there were German spies in New York City. There were German agitators. There were communities in America that had, in fact, sworn their loyalty to Germany all around the country. Pockets of German descendants, communities of German descendants that basically saw their future in an alliance with Germany, not with France and England. And so there were reasons, in fact, to suspect our own neighbors. But the ultimate, the paranoia that built up around these immigrant communities in America and these foreigners in our midst really sort of grew out of hand. And the politicians, of course, acted on it, and they capitalized on it for their own benefits, I believe. And so we passed very draconian sedition laws, and laws that I think have arguably been shown to, in fact, violate the Constitution. Certainly, imagine our soldiers, Montana soldiers, not being able to speak against the war effort. Here they were risking their lives for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, right? Our basic constitutional guarantees, risking their blood and their life for it, and they were not able to exercise those rights in their own state of Montana. I mean, that should be chilling to all of us. So, and then of course taking the Montana law and then nationalizing it, which did occur. Ours was one of the models that was used for what's called the Sedition Act of 1917, is pretty remarkable. So Montana, in some ways, had an undue influence in many spheres. We contributed, as Barb mentioned, per capita among the highest rates of soldiers who fought in the war effort. We know that the activities all around the state were heightened in favor of the war effort. Our horses, our wheat, our copper were essential for the Allies. So we had an undue influence on the war, and maybe the Sedition Act was another place where we impacted, maybe negatively, in my opinion, my personal opinion. There's a question right behind Jerry. Yes, Maria.
Yes, I was wondering in your research if you came across information about any of the individual artists from these war posters. And
oh, yeah,
these posters fit into their personal story as an artist before and after the war.
It's a wonderful question. The question is there information about the individual artists who were involved in these posters? And I actually will speak more about this later in the semester, in the term, when I talk about art and but the answer to your question is yes. We know many of these artists. We know them by name, both for our posters as well as for European posters. There's been quite a bit of research done on those artists. Some of them are quite intriguing, the stories that they have to tell. For example, there are a number of artists here who were German artists, made posters for Germany, but they were Jewish. So in the 1930s, they came to America and made posters for the United States that were used against the Nazis in World War II. So really some compelling stories there. Some of the German artists that you see in the exhibition became darlings of the Nazi regime. So some of them continued their careers, linked them from both World War I to World War II. A number of the artists in the German section of those poster artists, some of the wonderful artists that are there were darlings of the Nazis, and some of them died during World War II, and some of them were actually prosecuted by the Allies after World War II for working in the propaganda ministry. Yes, Richard.
A Montana political figure named Burton K. Wheeler was very critical of this war. And I wonder if his name has turned up in any of the documents that you've examined for this exhibit.
The question is if Burton K. Wheeler, who was a Montanan, shows up in the documentation about the war because of his criticisms of the Great War. And yes, the answer is obviously yes. He was a significant figure. But I didn't do much research on Wheeler. There is an institute in, I think is it Bozeman or Helena? It's in Bozeman, dedicated to Wheeler. I wonder to what extent they're doing anything over there at that other school related to Wheeler. I don't know, to be honest with you.
Any biographies of him
great. A new biography of Wheeler is in the works. Wonderful. Thank you for that tidbit. By the way, this war obviously intersects so much of our state history, but also American history. We didn't focus on Jeanette Rankin intentionally because, for one, the story is well known in Montana, so she does figure in our exhibition, but we thought it would be better to highlight individuals that are less than well known. But there are lots of avenues here to understanding the war through personalities like Burton K. Wheeler or Jeanette Rankin, individuals of that stature. One more question. Okay, let's go eat cake and champagne. Thank you very much.